Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Let the filibustering begin.
Welcome to Nerd Party.
Hello and welcome to our latest podcast interview from the Edinburgh International Film Festival. We've been so lucky to meet with some amazing acting talent and behind-the-scenes names, and I'm excited to share our conversations about movies, the festival, and cinema with you. Today's interview is with producer and writer Alex Lipschultz, who talks to me about Menashe. Set in the ultra-Orthodox world of the Hasidic Jew community in Brooklyn, strict religious traditions frown upon a child growing up in a home without a mother. By ignoring this precedent, Menashe risks being ostracized from the community he loves. Worse still, his son Rieven could be refused access to school. I hope you'll enjoy our discussion, and thanks again to Alex for giving up his time to meet with me. Enjoy the show.
I mean, even until just prior to Sundance, like a few weeks before they announced, we still didn't know what we were going to call it, and because we just couldn't agree on the title, and we were just finally like, fuck it, just call it Menashe. Nobody will be able to pronounce it, but we can't think of anything better.
I suppose that kind of opens up like one of the questions. I was thinking that like you must be really proud. I think this was A24's first foreign language feature.
Yeah.
How difficult was it going in, because obviously you're a producer as well as a writer, of thinking, right, we're going to do this in kind of a language that's not been really represented in cinema. Do you worry from a production point of view that, this is going to maybe limit our scope or our audience? And you think,
sure,
maybe if we just do it in English, this will get the audience.
Yeah, I think, I've had this experience in a few different movies where there's like some critical component to it that on the face of it seems like a terrible idea from a market perspective. There was making this film in Yiddish, and then the first feature I produced was a movie called Computer Chess, and we shot that on 40-year-old black and white analog video cameras. So it's black and white, it's kind of fuzzy, it's a far cry from modern HD. And both of those movies, a lot of people were like, don't do that. That is just going to cripple you. But honestly, my feeling ahead of each film, and then now that each one has kind of, that one was released years ago, and Menashe has now played a bunch of festivals and been acquired for distribution, so we kind of know where it's going. Mm-hmm. Maybe it'll crap out in theaters, but I think, honestly, those things that seem like they would make it terribly niche actually make the thing stand out a lot more as being unique. Rather than having a single language movie, we can say, it's just one of the first films that's entirely in Yiddish in 50, 60, 70 years. And I think the bottom line is that when you're making a film about this community with no stars, so on and so forth, it's like the ceiling for the kind of audience you're going to find and the kind of business you're going to do is only so high. Mm. So maybe you're lowering it a bit by deciding to make the whole thing in Yiddish, but I actually think that it made a stronger case for the creative elements of the film, and I think connected better with audiences and feels more specific by virtue of that. Yeah. So weirdly, I think it's actually made the movie more marketable in its own strange way.
When I was watching it, I thought it's the perfect representation of what a film festival movie should be about. That it's about a community or a story where you don't know anything about that, and by watching it you get to learn about something totally new. And I never knew about kind of the religious aspect where if you're widowed, the child has to go live with another. It was mind-blowing. What was it like kind of from a writing point of view to write this story to make sure that it was as authentic as possible? And I noticed that the actor Menashe Lustig, like a lot of the story was actually based on his life. How much did that play a role in the writing process, and how did it all kind of come together?
It's interesting, so the genesis of the movie was Josh Weinstein, the co-writer and director. I think he knew he wanted to make a film set in the Hasidic community in Brooklyn. He comes from a documentary background, so I think initially he thought like, okay, I'll make a doc about that world, and so he went out into that world the way he's done, having made prior docs, and just tried to meet people. And he randomly met Menashe through a few other Hasids he knew, and in talking to Menashe and learning about his backstory, it was like, oh, this guy has a fascinating life story, but you couldn't really make a documentary about it because everything has already sort of happened, and 99% of the people in his life would never, ever, ever be willing to be on camera. So I think at that point he kind of pivoted and was like, maybe there is a way to tell some kind of version of this story through the mechanics of narrative fiction, and having Menashe playing a version of himself and finding other people in the community to play versions of the various people in Menashe's life. So once he kind of made that decision, that was when he and I started talking about it. And I think in writing it, we wrote it with another writer, a Muslim guy named Musa Saeed, actually, who's a writer director in his own right in the States. You know, we had a number of conversations with Menashe about his life and his struggles and what had happened, but less than you would think. You know, like the movie is not sort of like beat for beat his autobiography. It's really taking like the loose structure and points of who he is as a man, what his personality is like, what his kind of, maybe some of his personal failings have or haven't been, or how they've been seen by various members of the community, and building something that felt like an interesting filmic narrative out of that. And we were kind of writing this thing as we went. We started shooting it from a treatment, actually, and shot the thing in pieces over the course of about a year and a half. And over that time, through additional writing and rewriting and improvisations and reshooting and everything, you know, cobbled something that feels, I think, like an organic narrative out of it. But a lot of it, you know, a lot of the finer points of the specifics of this culture, we didn't really gather from reading a ton of books or anything or academic materials. It was really just from talking with Menashe and talking with other Hasids and spending time in that world and just kind of trying to understand their life from the inside out, rather than from more kind of academic or ethnographic perspective of you know, outside in.
And how difficult was it, kind of from a production point of view, that this is a community that can be often against, say, like the television, social media, to go in there with film cameras and to even cast actors? How difficult a challenge was that, especially over a long period of time, and to get a consistency and kind of, for say, from their beards as well?
Yeah, it was hugely challenging. You know, I've produced work with non-professional actors before, and I've also produced work with movie stars before, and there's already a bit of a difference there. And when you're building a film that's meant to be with non-professionals, casting it is really what's going to make or break that movie. And it ends up being a situation where you just end up looking at a million people and trying to understand them and how they seem in person, how they're going to read on camera, if you know, like once you've got lights and a crew around, if they're just going to freeze up or not. But the nice thing is you kind of got endless options. With this, the thing that made it so much trickier, because almost none of the cast has ever acted before in their lives, and most of them have never even seen movies before in their lives. The tricky thing is that 95% of the people that we approach in the Hasidic world to see if they would even want to audition for a movie like this were just like, no way. No interest, not going to happen. So our options for who we could cast in the film were limited. And the way we kind of worked around that was, when we found people who seemed interesting and looked interesting and had kind of very specific, interesting personalities, we sort of re-engineered the roles to those people specifically. Not necessarily to like the biographical details of their lives, like the guy who plays the Rieven, the rabbi. He's not a rabbi. He's a cab driver, actually.
Oh, really?
But he had, interestingly enough, he had trained, he'd gone to yeshiva and trained to be a rabbi, so he had that background already. And I think somehow, once he started playing this role, it was like all that old rabbinical training. He actually became quite bossy. Once he was like, no, well, the rabbi says this. It's like, but just you're not actually a rabbi. But yeah, I think that was sort of one of the tricks of it, was really just re-engineering these roles and building them from the ground up for the specific people that we found who were open to being in a movie and who, with some screen tests, we felt like could perform naturally. And
have you had much feedback from that community, or is it something you're ultimately accepting? Kind of much of this film is about that community, and they might not be able to see this movie.
I mean, a huge part of the community will never watch this movie, and I'm sure that there are portions of it. I know for a fact, actually, there are portions of it that have been made aware of it just through word of mouth, and they're not happy that it exists. But interestingly enough, I think that there has been a lot of interest and excitement from that community. And the folks that have seen it, you know, it hasn't been released in the States yet theatrically. It's just played festivals, so it hasn't been available to the general public in any kind of long-standing form. It will be in a few weeks. But interestingly, we've been getting really good feedback from members of the Orthodox community. I think they feel like it captures their lives really authentically, and that it's fairly even-handed in terms of how it approaches them. I think the concern for a lot of them was that, you know, these sort of secular Jewish filmmakers were going to come in there and make something that was particularly damning, and that was just never our interest. I mean, the film, I think, is critical in a lot of ways, but it's even-handed and it's very loving. But I think the real test of how it may or may not be accepted in that community and what long-term ramifications for us and for our cast is still yet to be determined as this thing becomes more available to the public in the States.
And was that something that kind of stopped, say, Lustig, for example, like taking on this role? Because, you know, being in a movie like this can actually, I've heard it can mean like sort of banishment from the community, and like, how do you kind of overcome something like that? Does it mean...
I think all of our cast members had a lot of trepidation about doing the movie, and at various points throughout making it, we're like, oh man, maybe I shouldn't stay with this. And there was always the fear for Josh and I, particularly when we were shooting this thing on and off for a year and a half, like, what if one day Menashe or somebody else just wakes up and is like, I can't do this anymore, and then we've shot half a movie and can't get them to come back. Fortunately, that never happened. We lost one key actor about a week before we were going to start filming, and that created a lot of chaos in terms of recasting that role, but it all worked out in the end. But I think for all of them, they felt like whatever risks that they might be taking in terms of backlash in their community was worth it to them because they wanted to tell their stories. And thus far, they're all still in that world. Again, it's. I think over the next few months, we'll get a better sense to see what the reaction really is going to be.
One of the hardest things for Prolay from a producing point is working with kids, and especially a young kid over potentially a year of time. How do you kind of navigate like shooting something like that, where you've got a young kid, and then hopefully not by the end of it, you've maybe got facial hair or a big Adam's apple? We try.
So Rieven, who plays Rieven in the film, we tried to shoot most of his stuff in the very first section of the shoot. So 80% of his performance was shot in that first week, and he was about 6.5 or 7 at that point. And then about a year later, we brought him back for a few more days to do some additional scenes and reshoot a few scenes. And he grew a few inches. If you look really closely, his age fluctuates throughout the movie, but thus far, not a single person has ever commented on it. I mean, you have to really be paying attention.
That'll be something to keep an eye on when Netflix comes out.
But I mean, the trick with working with child actors, especially non-professional ones, it always comes down to the same thing, which is bribes. Mm-hmm. You bribe them with candy, you bribe them with fun. They'll do a scene twice, and then they'll be like, okay, and you'll be like, okay, we're going to move the cameras over here now. And they're like, no, we just did this. I don't want to do this again. It's like, oh God. But we've got some Skittles for you, if you can keep going.
Right.
And they're getting paid, but it's like they don't care about the money. So it's just about short-term goals and finding ways to kind of play around with them and have fun in between takes to kind of keep their energy up. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, Reuben's a really sweet kid, and I think was pretty game to be in the movie. And I think he came and saw it in Berlin during the festival then, and I think it was a totally surreal experience for him. I mean, we went up on stage, and there were probably 600-700 people in that audience, all Germans, and he just kind of looked over at me and was like, there are a lot of people here. I think it was finally dawning on him at that moment that this wasn't just this fun little thing that he was making with a handful of weird adults, that it was something that was going to be seen in a much wider way in the world.
And what has been the reaction from the stars and yourselves as you go on the festival circuit? Now you're here in Edinburgh to the movie. Have you been impressed by the response? Has it been what you've expected?
Yeah, I mean, the film has been really overwhelmingly positively received, which has been, a real honor and also an enormous relief. I think for Menashe, he was always sort of why is anybody going to want to watch this movie who's actually going to care about me? And that was part of his concern. And the other concern was that he's seen very, very few movies in his lifetime. I mean, maybe less than a dozen. Mm-hmm. And he'd never been in a movie theater prior to our premiere at Sundance. And so I think his understanding of movies and of acting and things like that was this notion of okay, here's a scene, you walk in a room and you sit down on a bed and you pray. Mm-hmm. For him, it's this isn't interesting. Where's all the drama? Where's all the full humor? Where's all the big emotions? And so there was, I think for him, when we were shooting it, he was sort of constantly who is going to care about this? There's nothing happening. And then when we actually sat down and watched the film with an audience in Park City for Sundance, it clicked for him. And he saw people weeping and clapping when it was all over. And I think he understood, the enormity of all of these people from all over the world and all walks of life connecting with his story in some way. And it was, I think, an enormously emotional experience for him at Sundance, that first screening. It was the unveiling of this movie that's based off his life, that he stars in every frame. It was also his first time in a movie theater watching a movie.
Sounds like a documentary in itself.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I wish we had cameras filming him throughout that process. I think there's footage of the Q&A itself, but yeah, none of us even realized it until the night before that he'd never been in a theater before. The night before, we were talking with the head of programming at Sundance, and he was like, "Oh, Menashe, are you excited to see your movie tomorrow?" And I was just like, "Wait a minute, Menashe, have you ever been to a movie theater before?" And he was like, "No." My God!
It must be a challenge as a producer to working on a set where usually you've got kind of seasoned actors and professionals that I need you here and this is this bit of technology. How do you go through like a process where you explain right? Kind of building something where you go like this is everything that you need to know and giving them all that information that you get secondhand.
I think they're definitely, it's a really different tool set for a director when you're working with non-professional actors than it is with professional actors. Professional actors, you can give them pretty tight blocking, you can dig into character psychology in a pretty deep way, they take direction, it can be very flexible, they're seasoned pros, they rehearse. With non-professional actors, I think a lot of the success of getting that to work is about keeping a sense of spontaneity and forcing them really to be interacting with each other. So what I learned from Andrew Bujalski, who had been directed the first film I produced, and has been making great films for 10 years now, mostly with non-professional actors, was he never showed them the scripts. He never gave them line readings. There was very little rehearsal. It was really just about giving people the right kind of context for the scene and then just working your way through it slowly and letting them kind of organically feel it out and giving them more time on average to shoot each scene than you would with pros. And so we took a similar approach with this film. And particularly by virtue of the fact that there was a fair bit of improvisation there, we hadn't rehearsed, so everyone was kind of figuring it out. Nobody had seen scripts, so they didn't know their lines. And the fact that the movie is in a foreign language that neither Josh nor I speak, everything moves really slowly. So every scene probably took 3 times as long to shoot as it would with English language pro actors. But I think it gives things a way to really organically evolve in a nice way over that time, and for not only the actors to kind of figure out the scene, but for Josh and I to kind of figure out each scene as well. And a lot of them changed quite significantly during the shooting process, just in terms of what we were getting from the actors.
You make it sound like it sounds like amazing that after all those hurdles that you had to overcome, that you've produced this amazing movie, and well done on all the reception.
Thank you. I mean, it's certainly like there's an alternate version of this movie that's just an unwatchable disaster. I think the key for it for us was always trying to keep things as authentic as possible and just moving really slowly but surely throughout the process of making it, rather than kind of rushing headlong into being like, all right, we're going to shoot this in a month, and once this train leaves the station, there's no stopping it. I think it's more like the process of creating other art. A painter you don't give a painter a few weeks to paint a painting. They take their time. A composer takes their time to compose, and it was a similar process that I think is quite different than how most films are made.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and all the best with your festival run. And you've made an amazing movie. Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Join the revolution. Join the Nerd Party.
Welcome to Nerd Party.